Who was he? Well, the sources that we have available to us write about him in very glowing and positive sorts of terms. Unfortunately, the popular knowledge of Timur tends to take a slightly different position and focus on the massive destruction and carnage that he left in his wake. So thinking about his personality or his makeup, his identity, it's a very, very tricky topic.
So perhaps we can't ever really get to the bottom of what he was like as a person, but what isn't in question is his brutality as a conqueror.
His cruelty in battle, or his savagery, was always calculated to make a point. One of the greatest atrocities Timur committed was in 1401 on taking Baghdad, when he ordered 90,000 heads to be brought to him at the end of the battle. And these were grouped into 22 towers which girdled the city. And there are a couple of eyewitness accounts who describing these terrible scenes of towers rising up with heads cemented into towers and illuminated at night. The point being, this was proof, don't mess with me or you will lose your head, quite simply. As a conqueror, you can compare him very easily with Genghis Khan, but in terms of his cultural interests, he was his own man. Genghis had nothing but scorn for the settled life, for cities. Culture was something for sissies. For Tamerlane, or Timur, it was rather different. He went around Central Asia looting the great cities of the East, took miniaturists, calligraphers, architects, masons, gem cutters, silk weavers, glass cutters from the cities he'd conquered, brought them back to Samarkand, and started an incredible building spree, which resulted in the great city of Samarkand, which became known as the Pearl of the East.
What remains in present-day Samarkand is only a small portion of what was there under Timur. He built great monuments to impress the settled population, but he was also aware of what would please his Turco-Mongol followers. And we know he magnified his prestige with great tented palaces here, richly furnished with carpets and textiles in the true nomadic tradition.
Undoubtedly, Timur is a very evocative and provocative figure. One of the things that he's famous for is integrating his Central Asian origins, his steppe nomadic origins, if you like, into court life. And perhaps the most interesting and exquisite of the objects that we have to do with Timur in this exhibition are the books. Because Timur realized very early on that he could immortalize not only himself and his kins, but also his deeds by writing and having books written about him.
And it's in these books and drawings that we can see this integration of Asian culture and a continuing influence of the art of China. One of Tamerlane's greatest victories was at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, when he triumphed over the armies of the Ottomans. And yet his dynasty was soon to be eclipsed by them. In a century or so, the Ottoman dynasty had already made much of today's Turkey their own, and had their sights firmly set on the glorious city of Constantinople.
That dream was realized by this man, looking very tough and painted by the Venetian artist Gentile Bellini, Mehmet II, who was not only reckoned by some to be a patron of the arts even greater than his contemporaries in Europe, but also the founder of a 500-year Ottoman Empire.
The Ottomans were another tribal grouping, incredibly successful at fighting their local rivals just to the east of Timur's empire. But unlike Timur, their ambitions were directed to the west. With much of the territory surrounding Constantinople already in their hands, it was only a matter of time before they reached the Byzantine capital. Mehmet II, only 20 years old, took the city in 1453.
The capture of Constantinople gives him a marvelous base. It secures communications between Turkey and Asia and Turkey and Europe. It gives him a naval base. It effectively gives him control of the Black Sea within the next few years. It also fulfills old Islamic prophecies that the Muslims were destined to capture the place. And finally, it gives him a kind of status as heir of the Caesars.
When Mehmet the Conqueror took Constantinople, the city was in ruins. It had been constantly attacked for over 200 years. It had been laid waste by the Crusaders. There was not much left of the great glory of the Byzantine city. And Mehmet started rebuilding it. He was making a great statement about the intentions of the Ottomans, laying down the foundations for their great empire.
Within a few years, Mehmed decides to build the Yeni Saray, or as it's known today, the Topkapi Palace. It's beautifully situated. It looks down on the Golden Horn, the Straits of the Bosphorus and the Marmara Sea. Fabulous views. But I think the big reason he builds this palace is to get away from the crowds of Constantinople, to seclude himself, to withdraw from his subjects, to be more secure in his life.
Rather than a single building, Topkapi was conceived as a series of pavilions contained by 4 enormous courtyards, a sort of stone version of the tented encampments with which the nomadic Ottomans were familiar.
The palace has functions which a modern Western palace wouldn't necessarily have. One of its main functions was to be a training school for senior officers and civil servants. Another function was that it was a design center, and attached to the library there were a team of designers who commissioned works and sent out the designs for ceramics, for rugs, for books, for jade, for all manner of artworks.
Just outside the gates or the walls of the Topkapi is the Hagia Sophia, the great Byzantine church of Saint Sophia. And this building was a fantastic creation of the Byzantines and was a great church celebrated across Christendom. And what Mehmet did was that rather than destroy this church and build a mosque on top of it, he just adapted it. He put minarets in there, he changed the situation of the altar and modified the interior to reflect Muslim belief.
Mehmet, from what we know about him, seems to have taken the responsibilities of being an Eastern Islamic ruler and a East Roman Western ruler very seriously, and to have understood this dual tradition as being one in which he should sponsor humanists, scholars, intellectuals, poets, artists of all of the different traditions who were living under his rule. And so if you look at his patronage of art, especially the art of the book, what you'll find is a vigorous intellectual activity at his court, objects, books that are made for him, for his personal library, and an incredibly learned library that covers the complete range from works of geography and rhetoric and law to all of the different literatures of these various traditions.
The seeds of his interest in acquiring learning from both East and West would have been sown from an early age by his tutors.
On the left-hand side of the page of Mehmed II's sketchbook, you see his attempts to devise or practice his tugra. This is an elaborate kind of concertinaed form of the Ottoman imperial signature, peculiar to and distinctive to each Ottoman sultan. He's had several goes. They're not terribly impressive. He was obviously very young when this sketchbook was made, maybe 10 or 12 years old. The really interesting thing, however, are these pictures down at the bottom. They're not actually very good. They're not great art. It's touching that this piece of juvenilia has been preserved in the Topkapi Palace. They're probably servants of the court. What's interesting about them, I think, is that they do suggest, and other drawings on other pages of the book suggest even more strongly, that he's already having lessons in the Western way of doing portraiture. And some of the other pictures show he's playing around with shading to suggest volume, something which is really rather un-Turkish for a painter to work at. So I think he did have a Western art tutor when he was a boy, and this lies behind his interest in commissioning portraits and medals later on in life.
The celebrated Venetian artist Gentile Bellini worked for him for over a year.